They believed they were sentencing him to death, cloaked in a mean-spirited prank. When the richest man in Kentucky aimed to disgrace his poorest stable hand by giving him a violent stallion and a saddle rescued from the garbage, the high society crowd chuckled. They anticipated a tragedy, but they were unaware that the shattered horse possessed a champion's spirit, or that the decaying saddle hid a secret valued in the millions, a secret powerful enough to topple a corrupt dynasty. This is a tale of the kind of justice that sends shivers down your spine, and you won't want to miss a moment of this final reckoning. Before we see this amazing transformation unfold, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support truly helps us grow and continue bringing you these impactful stories about horses. Now, let's step through the icy gates of the Blackwood estate. The frost clinging to the iron gates wasn't just winter's touch. It was a solid wall, a pale, crystalline crust that gave the world a false, harsh beauty. For Thomas Miller, the cold held no beauty. It was a relentless weight. At 4 in the morning, the Kentucky air had a bite. It cut through the thin wool of his worn jacket, hunting for the warmth of his skin with a vicious focus, settling deep into his bones, a constant ache that echoed the persistent, grinding fear he'd carried in his stomach for 3 long years. Thomas moved across the cobblestone yard, his breath puffing out in short, steady clouds that vanished instantly into the darkness. He was 16, but his shadow was that of a tired old man. His hands were red and rough, the knuckles swollen, looking a decade older than the rest of him. They were permanently marked with the grime of stable work, oil, leather dye, and soil that no scrubbing could ever erase. To his left stood the main house, a vast Georgian mansion of red brick and white columns that seemed to sleep in smug silence. Not one light shone in its 50 windows. It sat heavily on the land, a monument to wealth that felt no pain. To his right were the main stables, a building that cost more to construct than Thomas would make in 100 lifetimes. It was a cathedral for horses, smelling of sweet hay, polished wood, and old money. But Thomas didn't head for the warmth of the heated tack room. He turned his collar up against the cutting wind and walked past the grand entrance, making his way toward the shadowy edge of the property. Back there, hidden behind a cluster of unkempt weeping willows that whipped in the wind like grieving women, stood the caretaker's shack. It was a drafty, sinking building that Arthur Worthington allowed Thomas and his mother to live in, part of his so-called generous employment terms, a generosity that felt more like a chain. Thomas paused at the door, his hand hovering over the latch. The metal was so cold it seared his fingertips. He held his breath, listening. The sound he dreaded most seeped through the thin wood. A wet, rattling cough that seemed to claw at the morning's quiet. It was a sound that turned his stomach, the sound of fluid and lungs too weak to clear it. He pushed the door open softly, trying to be a ghost. The inside was dim, lit only by the low orange glow of a space heater rattling in the corner, fighting a hopeless fight against the drafts whining through the window frames. His mother, Sarah, was a small shape under a pile of mismatched quilts on the pull-out sofa. The air in the room smelled of damp plaster, menthol rub, and the sharp, metallic hint of sickness. Her voice was a whisper, fragile as dry leaves crunching on gravel. Thomas winced. He had hoped to slip out before she woke. He didn't want her to see the weariness in his eyes. "It's just me, Ma," he said, his voice dropping to that soft, calming tone he usually saved for spooked foals. He moved to the tiny kitchenette, pouring water from a plastic jug into the kettle. "Go back to sleep." "The medicine," she murmured, shifting with a wince. The movement sparked a fresh fit of coughing that shook her thin frame, making the bed tremble. Thomas paused, his hand tightening around the kettle handle until his knuckles went white. He stared at the peeling paint on the wall, following a crack that looked like a lightning bolt. The pharmacy had called 3 times. The credit card was declined. The insurance Arthur Worthington provided was a bare-bones policy that covered broken bones for workers, but labeled Sarah's autoimmune treatment as optional and experimental. "I'm handling it, Ma," Thomas lied. The guilt tasted like ashes and pennies in his mouth. He hated lying to her, but the truth that they were broke and helpless would kill her faster than the illness. "Don't you worry." Mr. Kane mentioned there might be a bonus for the spring foaling season. There was no bonus. There was only the endless grind, but Thomas couldn't tell her that. He couldn't tell her that every time he looked at Mr. Worthington, he felt a hatred so pure and hot it scared him. He brought her a cup of tea, the ceramic warm against his frozen fingers, watched her trembling hands hold it, and then stepped back out into the freezing dark. He had to stay unseen. He had to be helpful. He had to survive. By the time the sun began to smear grey light over the horizon, lighting up the frost on the trimmed hedges, Thomas had already mucked out 12 stalls. The physical work was a small mercy. It kept his blood moving, kept his mind from fixating on the eviction warnings disguised as friendly reminders piling up on the kitchen table. The head groom, Marcus Kane, stood by the office door, sipping steaming coffee from a silver travel mug. Kane was a man who wore his cruelty like a second skin, thick, leathery, and unfeeling. He wore expensive boots that never got dirty, and he saw the horses as numbers on a spreadsheet, figures that either added up or didn't. "You missed a spot in the wash bay, Miller," Kane barked, his voice slicing through the morning calm. He didn't bother to look up from his clipboard. "I'll get it, sir," Thomas said, keeping his eyes on his boots. "Keep your head down. Don't give them a reason. You'd better. Mr. Julian arrives today." The threat hung in the air, sharp and real. The mention of Julian Worthington made the other stable hands exchange nervous looks as they hurried past with wheelbarrows. Arthur's nephew was the heir to the Blackwood fortune, a young man of 22 who treated horses like dirt bikes, machines to be revved up, used, and thrown away when they broke. The day unfolded with frantic energy, the estate buzzing with the tense nervousness that always came with the family's presence. A new horse had been delivered the night before, a massive black Hanoverian stallion named Obsidian. He was locked in the isolation barn, a high-security area usually kept for sick animals. The rumors among the grooms were dark. They whispered the horse had killed a man in Germany. They said he was unridable, a demon in horse flesh. They said he had been beaten into insanity. At noon, the so-called monster was led into the main round pen. Thomas watched from the shadows of the half-door, unable to look away. Obsidian was magnificent. 17 hands of solid muscle, his coat the color of a moonless night, soaking up the light instead of reflecting it. But his body language screamed panic. His tail lashed violently, his eyes showed white with terror, and his ears were pinned flat against his skull. He wasn't mean, he was frantic. He was a creature backed into a corner. Julian Worthington leaned against the white fence, dressed in pristine, custom-tailored riding clothes that had never seen a real day's work. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting his own arrogance. He laughed, a sharp, braying sound that grated on Thomas's nerves. "Look at him, acting tough," Julian sneered. "Bring him over." Two grooms struggled to hold Obsidian's lead rope, their boots sliding in the mud. Julian climbed into the saddle with the grace of a sack of potatoes, heavy and unbalanced. He landed hard, jolting the horse's spine. Before the horse could even adjust to the weight, Julian dug sharp spurs into the animal's sensitive sides. Julian shouted, slapping a riding crop across the stallion's shoulder. Thomas flinched in the doorway as if the blow had hit him. He saw the muscles in Obsidian's back twitch in pain. The horse didn't want to fight, he wanted to understand, but Julian only spoke the language of pain. Confused, hurting, and terrified, Obsidian did the only thing he could. He reared. It was a vertical leap, powerful and desperate. The horse stood on his hind legs, pawing at the sky. Julian, having no balance, slid backward. He grabbed the reins to save himself, yanking the horse's mouth with the brutal metal bit. Obsidian twisted in the air, screaming in pain, and came down hard, bucking violently. Julian flew through the air, arms and legs waving, and landed face first in the muddy slush of the pen. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the stallion's heavy breathing. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Julian scrambled up, his face purple with rage and mud. He spat out dirt. "He tried to kill me, did you see that?" Arthur Worthington stepped out from the viewing gallery. The patriarch of Blackwood leaned on his cane, his suit perfect, his eyes cold and shrewd behind wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't ask if his nephew was hurt. He looked at the horse with contempt, calculating the lost investment, the bad publicity, the waste. Julian screamed, wiping muck from his mouth. "That horse cost $500,000, Julian," Arthur said flatly, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Arthur's gaze drifted across the yard, past the terrified horse, past the cowering staff, and landed on Thomas, frozen in the doorway of the loft. A cruel smile curled the old man's thin lips. He saw a chance, a way to teach his spoiled nephew a lesson about gratitude, and at the same time humiliate the stable boy whose quiet self-respect always annoyed him. Arthur shouted, pointing his cane at Thomas. Thomas climbed down the ladder, his legs feeling like lead, his heart pounding against his ribs. He walked into the center of the yard, painfully aware of every groom, rider, and wealthy spectator watching him. He felt small, dirty, and poor. Arthur asked, his voice smooth as oil. "Yes, sir," Thomas whispered, staring at the ground. "Well, today is your lucky day," Arthur announced, turning to the small crowd that had gathered. "My nephew has no use for this trash." Julian blinked, stunned. "Uncle Arthur, you can't be serious." "He's perfect for a boy like Thomas," Arthur sneered. "Garbage for garbage, he's yours, boy, take him." "But he doesn't eat my grain, he doesn't sleep in my stalls. You take him to that shack of yours, if you can keep him alive, fine." The staff snickered. Kane smirked, crossing his arms. And Arthur added, gesturing to a pile of refuse near the tack room where broken equipment was tossed before the dump run. "You'll need tack, Kane. Give him that old saddle we pulled out of the basement." Kane jogged over and grabbed a saddle covered in thick grey dust. The leather looked dry and cracked, the stirrups rusted. He threw it at Thomas's feet. It landed with a dull, heavy thud in the mud, splattering Thomas's boots. "Good luck with your prize, boy," Arthur said, turning his back. "Now everyone back to work." Thomas stood alone in the center of the pen. The massive black horse snorted, trembling, his sides heaving with sweat, white foam dripping from his mouth where the bit had cut him. Thomas looked down at the broken saddle, then up at the terrified animal. He didn't feel the shame Arthur intended. He felt a sudden, overpowering wave of understanding. He looked into the horse's eye. It wasn't the eye of a killer. It was the eye of a victim. "We're the same," Thomas thought, "both of us trapped here." He walked slowly toward the horse, ignoring Kane's warning shout from the office. He didn't raise his hands, he didn't make a sound. He just projected a deep, steady calm, a silent promise that the pain was over. He stopped 2 feet from the stallion's nose. The horse flinched, expecting a blow. "It's okay," Thomas breathed, the words barely audible, carried on the wind. "I know they hurt you." Obsidian froze. The horse lowered his head an inch, sniffing the air. He smelled fear on the boy. Yes, the sharp scent of adrenaline, but underneath it he smelled kindness. He smelled a kindred spirit. Thomas reached out and took the laid rope. He didn't pull. He just turned and began to walk toward the rundown shed behind his cottage. And for the first time in months, the great black horse followed willingly. The shed was a wreck. The roof leaked, daylight peeking through the rotten shingles. The floor was dirt, packed hard by decades of neglect, and the wind whistled through gaps in the walls, making a sad, moaning sound. But to Thomas, as he led the horse inside that evening, it felt like a safe haven. It was the only place on the estate where Arthur's gaze couldn't reach. He spent the first hour just waterproofing the roof with a plastic tarp he'd salvaged from a dumpster. The horse stood in the corner, watching him with wide, wary eyes, tracking his every move. Thomas didn't force interaction. He filled a bucket with water from his own kitchen tap and brought out a bag of oats he had bought with his grocery money, money that should have gone to food for himself. "I can't call you Obsidian," Thomas said softly, sitting on an overturned crate in the corner. That's a hard name, cold like a rock. The horse chewed slowly, the rhythm of his jaw the only sound in the shed. His ears flicked toward Thomas's voice, listening. Redemption, Thomas said, testing the word. It felt heavy but hopeful. It tasted like a promise. Outside, the wind began to howl, warning of a coming storm. Rain lashed against the thin wooden walls, sounding like gravel being thrown at the structure. Thomas looked at the saddle Arthur had thrown at him. It was sitting on a sawhorse in the corner, looking like trash, a useless pile of leather. He picked up a rag and a tin of leather oil he kept for his boots. He needed to keep his hands busy to stop from thinking about his mother's coughing in the house next door. He began to wipe away decades of grime from the saddle. As the first layer of grey dust came off, Thomas paused. The leather beneath wasn't cheap cowhide. It was a deep, rich mahogany color, buttery soft despite the neglect. It drank the oil greedily, darkening to a glossy shine. The stitching was intricate, done by hand with a precision Thomas had never seen, even on Julian's $10,000 custom French saddles. This was built by a master. He worked faster, his heart rate picking up. Why would Arthur throw this away? He cleaned the skirt of the saddle, rubbing the oil into the parched grain. He flipped the fender over to clean the underside. There, stamped into the leather near the stirrup bar, was a maker's mark. It wasn't a corporate logo, it was a simple set of hand-carved initials. W. Thomas ran his thumb over the letters. W. Jim Worthington, he knew the name. Everyone in Kentucky horse country knew the name, though it was spoken in whispers. Jim was Arthur's younger brother, the one who had disappeared 20 years ago. The legend said Jim was the true horseman of the family, a man who could whisper to wild mustangs and calm storms. The story went that he had died broke and crazy, cut off from the family. Arthur never spoke of him. Thomas noticed that the flap of the saddle felt unusually thick, perhaps reinforced with a double layer of leather, but he was too focused on the history of the piece to investigate further. It felt balanced. Even sitting on the sawhorse, it had a center of gravity that felt intentional, almost magical. Redemption took a step forward. The horse stretched his neck out, nostrils flaring, and nudged Thomas's shoulder. It was a hesitant, gentle touch, an apology for the violence of the afternoon, a question asked in the dark. Thomas buried his face in the horse's coarse mane, smelling the dust, the rain, and the warm animal scent of life. Tears he had been holding back all day finally leaked from his eyes, hot and stinging. "We're going to show them, Red," Thomas whispered into the fur. The weeks that followed were a blur of exhaustion and discovery. Thomas lived a double life. By day, he was the invisible stable boy, taking abuse from Cain, mucking stalls, and avoiding Arthur's stare. By night, under the silver light of the moon, he was a trainer. He didn't use a bit. He didn't use spurs. He made a rope halter and rode Redemption in the overgrown pasture behind the shack. One night, a plastic bag blew across the field, caught in a gust of wind. It flapped violently against a fence post, a terrifying monster to a prey animal. Redemption froze, his muscles bunching to bolt. In the past, Julian would have hit him, clamped his legs down, forced him to face it. Thomas did the opposite. He let out a long, audible breath and softened his entire body. He waited. He hummed a low tune. Redemption's ears swiveled back to listen to the hum. The tension drained from his neck. He lowered his head and walked past the flapping bag without a second glance. It was a breakthrough. The horse wasn't stubborn. He was sensitive. He was a Ferrari being driven by people who only knew how to drive tractors. With Thomas's subtle weight shifts, Redemption flowed over the ground like water. He could jump a 5-foot fence from a standstill. He had a heart that wanted to please, buried under layers of hurt. Thomas spent every spare minute restoring the saddle. He stitched the tears with fishing line, oiled the leather until it glowed, and polished the silver ornaments. It was during one of these late-night repair sessions, 3 weeks after the so-called gift, that his world turned upside down. The seat of the saddle had a lump in the padding. Thomas had assumed it was bunched wool, common in old saddles. But as he massaged the oil in, he felt something crinkle. It sounded like paper. Curiosity nudged him. With a trembling hand, he took a razor blade and carefully picked the stitches along the seam of the seat. He reached inside the padding. His fingers brushed against something wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled it out. It was a flat, dense packet. He unwrapped the oilcloth to reveal a thick envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax that had cracked with time. Thomas broke the seal. He pulled out 3 documents. The first was a letter written in a sprawling, energetic hand. To the rider who finds this, if you are reading this, then you have done what my brother Arthur never could. You have seen the value in something broken. Thomas scanned the letter, his breath catching. It detailed Jim's despair, his love for the horses, and his brother's betrayal. But beneath the letter was the prize, the Blackwood Trust. The documents clearly named the bearer of the saddle and owner of Obsidian as the beneficiary. Thomas sat frozen. The wind rattled the shed door, but he couldn't feel the cold. In his hands he held the deed to everything. The stables, the mansion, the land, it was all legally his. It was enough to save his mother. It was enough to buy the best doctors in the world. The realization hit him like a physical blow. We aren't poor anymore. He stood up, clutching the papers to his chest. He had to tell his mother. He had to get to a lawyer. He rushed out of the shed and into the cottage. Sarah was awake, coughing into a handkerchief that came away spotted with red. Thomas gasped, falling to his knees beside her bed. He spread the papers out on the quilt. He explained it all. The saddle, Jim, the hidden will. Sarah's eyes went wide, fear wrestling with hope. She touched the paper as if it were sacred. "Thomas, be careful," she rasped, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "Arthur, he's a dangerous man. It's legal, Ma. You need a copy," she whispered urgently, her mother's instinct cutting through her illness. "Right now. Use your phone." Thomas fumbled in his pocket for his old, cracked smartphone. It had barely any battery left, 12%. He laid the documents flat on the quilt. His hands were shaking so hard he had to brace his elbows against the mattress to get a clear shot. He took high-resolution photographs of the letter, the will, and the deed. "Send them," Sarah commanded. "Send them to that legal aid clinic in Lexington, the one that helped Mrs. Thomas." Tapped the screen, attaching the files. The signal was weak out here on the edge of the estate. The progress bar crawled slowly. "Sending, sending, come on." Thomas hissed at the screen. "Sent." A small ping confirmed the email had gone through. Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He quickly opened a second email draft to send them to his own backup account. But before he could type the address, the front door of the cottage exploded inward. Splinters flew across the room. Marcus Kane stood there, silhouetted by the blinding floodlights of the estate security truck parked on the lawn. Arthur Worthington was right behind him, his cane tapping ominously on the threshold. "Grab him," Arthur ordered, his voice empty of emotion. Before Thomas could move, 2 uniformed guards were on him. They pinned his arms behind his back, shoving him face first into the floor. His phone skittered across the linoleum and Kane kicked it hard, sending it sliding under the sofa. Kane marched over to the bed and snatched up the papers from the quilt. Sarah screamed, a raw, terrifying sound of violation. Thomas shouted, struggling against the heavy boot on his back, "Leave her alone." Kane handed the oilcloth packet to Arthur. Arthur adjusted his glasses, glanced at the contents, and let out a dry, rattling laugh. Jim, always the dramatic fool. He pulled a gold lighter from his pocket. The flame flickered in the drafty room, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Thomas screamed, dust filling his mouth. "You can't destroy it." "I am the law here, boy," Arthur said softly, his eyes dead. He flicked the lighter. The flame caught the corner of the yellowed paper. Thomas watched in horror as the deed, the will, the letter, all of it curled into black ash and floated to the floor, mixing with the dust. "Now," Arthur said, brushing the ash from his hands as if it were merely dirt. "You are trespassing. You have stolen estate property. I should have you arrested." Thomas slumped in the guard's grip. He knew he had the digital copies, but would they be enough? Digital files could be dismissed, argued against, or tied up in court for years while his mother died. He needed something undeniable. He needed Arthur to act publicly. But Arthur continued, a glint of malice sparking in his eyes. I am a sporting man and I have a problem. The Lexington Gold Cup is this Saturday. Julian needs to win to secure a sponsorship I want. But Julian is lacking in confidence. Arthur stepped closer, invading Thomas's space. He smelled of expensive cologne and cruelty. You think you're a horseman? You think this beast is a champion? Prove it. I will make you a deal. If you can ride this animal in the Gold Cup and beat Julian, I will acknowledge the claim you think you have. Thomas said, his voice shaking with rage. I burned a copy, Arthur lied smoothly. Thomas knew it was a lie, but he also saw the trap. Arthur wanted a spectacle. He wanted to crush Thomas publicly to discredit any rumors. The original is in my attorney's vault. Win and it's yours. It was a trap. Thomas knew it. Arthur controlled the show. He controlled the judges. But what choice did he have? He needed to buy time for the lawyers to see the email, and he needed a public stage to expose Arthur. I accept, Thomas said, looking Arthur in the eye. Arthur smiled, a shark sensing blood in the water. Good. The week leading up to the Gold Cup was a nightmare of anxiety. Thomas barely slept. He trained redemption in the daylight now, ignoring the stares of the staff and the cold indifference of the other riders. The horse was ready. He was fit, muscular, and completely in tune with Thomas. They moved as one being, a telepathic connection of weight and breath, but the enemy was not idle. The night before the show, Thomas stayed in the shed until midnight. He checked the water, checked the hay, double-checked the latch on the door. He whispered a final promise to the horse and went inside to catch 3 hours of sleep, his body vibrating with nerves. At 2 in the morning, a shadow slipped into the shed. The lock had been picked with professional ease. It wasn't Arthur. Arthur didn't dirty his hands, it was Kane. He moved silently, carrying a syringe filled with a clear liquid, a cocktail of sedatives and a muscle relaxant. Not enough to knock a horse out, but enough to make his reflexes slow, his judgment cloudy, enough to ensure a knockdown rail, a refusal, or a crash. He injected it into a crisp red apple. He held it out in the dark. Redemption, who had learned to trust humans again because of Thomas, took it gently. He chewed, swallowed, and the poison entered his blood. When Thomas entered the shed at 5 in the morning, his heart stopped. Redemption was standing with his head low, almost touching the ground. His eyes were glazed and unfocused. He was sweating, with profuse patches of foam shivering. Thomas checked his gums. They were pale. Thomas groaned, falling against the horse's neck. He tried to walk the horse, but Redemption stumbled, his legs crossing over each other like a drunkard's. The trailer ride to the showgrounds was 2 hours away. There was no way he could jump a Grand Prix course, fences standing 1.6 meters high in this condition. It would be suicide. Thomas ran to the cottage, bursting through the door. Ma, he's sick, they drugged him. Sarah Miller pushed herself up. She looked terrible, her skin waxy and grey, but her eyes were fierce. She pointed to the cupboard where she kept her herbs and remedies, the folk medicine she relied on when doctors were too expensive. Activated charcoal, she wheezed, sitting up, and the peppermint oil. We can't afford a vet, and Arthur owns them all anyway. Do it, Thomas. Thomas mixed the black slurry in a bucket, his hands shaking so hard he spilled half the water. He ran back to the shed and used a large dosing syringe to force the mixture down Redemption's throat. The horse gagged, black liquid dripping from his muzzle, but he swallowed. Then Thomas spent the next hour walking the horse, forcing him to move, keeping his blood pumping. Come on, Red, you have to burn it off, please. For Jim, the horse's eyes were clearing. The charcoal had done its work, binding to the toxins before they could be fully absorbed. He was still groggy, moving with a slight delay, but he was standing square. It would have to be enough. The drive to the showgrounds took 2 hours. Thomas pulled in with his rusted pickup truck and the rattling single-horse trailer, parking next to the million-dollar rigs that hummed with generators and air conditioning. Thomas led Redemption out. The contrast was painful. The horse looked rough, his mane wasn't braided, his coat was clean but not gleaming with silicone sprays, but he looked powerful like a prizefighter entering a ballroom. Saddle onto Redemption's back. The rich mahogany stood out against the black fur. It didn't look like the modern, lightweight, synthetic saddles everyone else used. It looked like history. It looked heavy. As Thomas walked toward the warm-up ring, he saw Julian. Julian was mounted on a stunning Dutch warmblood, a creature of pure athletic arrogance. Julian smirked, leaning down. "Nice donkey," Julian called out loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. Thomas didn't answer, he mounted. Redemption felt a little heavy in the bridle, the residue of the drug still lingering, but his ears were pricked toward the jumps. He knew his job. "Trust me," Thomas whispered to the horse's withers. The class began. It was a massacre. The course was massive. Huge oxers that looked as wide as cars, tight combinations, and a water jump that spooked 3 horses in a row. Thomas watched from the in-gate. He saw Arthur standing near the judge's booth, whispering to the course designer. Arthur pointed his cane at the triple combination, the most difficult element of the course. The designer hesitated, looking uncomfortable, but Arthur leaned in, saying something low and threatening. The designer nodded and signaled the ring crew. They moved the standards of the third fence in by 6 inches. It was a subtle change, almost invisible to the naked eye, but deadly. It made the distance between the jumps mathematically impossible for a normal stride. A horse would land from the second jump and be too close to the third to take off safely. It was designed to cause a crash. Julian went 5th. He rode with aggression, fighting his horse every step of the way. They knocked a rail at the vertical and the horse stumbled in the combination, but they finished. The announcer boomed the score. 4 faults, time 78 seconds. It was a good score, hard to beat on a course this tough. Thomas was the last to go. He trotted into the massive arena. A hush fell over the crowd. They knew the story. The stable boy, the killer horse, the joke gift. They expected blood. They expected a wreck. Thomas saluted the judge's box where Arthur sat like a king on a throne. Arthur didn't return the salute. He just stared, waiting for the fall. The bell rang, a shrill sound that cut the air. Thomas gathered the reins. "Okay, Jim," he thought, channeling the spirit of the man who made the saddle. "Ride with us." They started. Redemption cantered toward the first jump. He felt sluggish. Thomas had to use more leg than usual, squeezing with everything he had. "Wake up, Red, wake up." They cleared the first fence, rubbing the rail. It wobbled but stayed up. The crowd gasped, then something happened. As they turned toward the second jump, a massive oxer, Redemption seemed to realize where he was. The atmosphere, the crowd, the challenge, it woke the champion inside him. The adrenaline surged, burning off the last of the sedative fog. He locked onto the fence. His stride lengthened. He ceased to be a heavy, drugged animal and became a creature of flight. Thomas stopped riding with his hands and rode with his heart. He felt the saddle beneath him. It was perfect. It placed him exactly where he needed to be, centered and balanced, allowing him to feel every muscle in the horse's back. They flew over the water jump. They cleared the massive wall. Then came the trap, the triple combination. Vertical, oxer, vertical. Thomas saw it as he approached. He saw the shortened distance. He knew Arthur had rigged it. "Wait," Thomas commanded internally. Instead of pushing for the long stride, Thomas sat deep in the saddle. He collected Redemption, coiling the horse's energy like a spring. It was a dangerous move. If they lost momentum, they wouldn't clear the height. Redemption listened. He shortened his stride, trusting Thomas completely. They popped the first element, took a bouncing stride, cleared the second. The third fence loomed, too close, impossible. Thomas yelled. Redemption exploded upward. He defied physics, launching from a near standstill with raw vertical power. He tucked his knees up to his chin. He cleared the back rail by a millimeter. They landed. The crowd erupted, a roar of sound that shook the stands. Thomas pushed for the finish line. He glanced at the clock. 76 seconds. They crossed the beam. Clear round, time 77.5 seconds. He had beaten Julian. The stadium shook with applause. It was the kind of noise you feel in your teeth. Thomas dropped the reins and hugged Redemption's neck, sobbing into the black mane. They had done the impossible, but over the loudspeaker a voice cut through the joy like a knife. The crowd hushed instantly. Arthur Worthington leaned into his microphone in the judge's booth. His face was red, veins bulging. Rider disqualified, illegal equipment, that saddle is deemed unsafe and not regulation. Thomas froze. He looked up at the booth. Arthur was smiling. He had found his loophole. He didn't care about the ride. He had found a rulebook technicality. Bring the horse and saddle to the stewards for inspection, Arthur commanded. Thomas rode to the center of the ring. He felt cold. He had won and he was still losing. Two stewards approached. One was Marcus Kane, grinning like a jackal. The other was an older man with white hair and a military bearing, Colonel Holloway, the head of the Regional Equestrian Board. Get off, Kane snarled, reaching for the reins. Give me the saddle. Wait, Colonel Holloway said. His voice was gravel and authority. He pushed Kane aside. Holloway ran his hand over the pommel. He looked at the deep mahogany. He looked at Thomas. Holloway asked softly, "Mr. Worthington gave it to me," Thomas said, his voice trembling. Holloway's eyes widened. "Jim, I haven't seen this workmanship in 20 years." Arthur shouted from the booth, his voice echoing over the speakers, "Tear it off the horse." Holloway ignored him. He lifted the saddle flap. He frowned. He felt the unusual thickness of the leather, the same thickness Thomas had noticed but hadn't investigated. Holloway pulled a small penknife from his pocket. Kane demanded. "Checking the integrity," Holloway said. With a swift, precise motion, he sliced the stitching of the false lining on the underside of the flap and peeled back the leather. The stadium lights caught the glint of gold. Stamped into the inner layer of the leather, hidden for 20 years, was a block of text embossed in gold leaf. Holloway signaled the camera crew. "Get a shot of this," he ordered. The image was projected onto the massive jumbotron screen that hung over the arena. "Whosoever rides the horse Obsidian with this saddle in sanctioned competition shall be recognized as the legal heir to the Worthington Trust." The crowd gasped, a collective murmur of shock rippling through the stands. "It seems," Holloway announced, a smile cracking his stern face, "that Jim Worthington didn't trust paper. He knew paper could be burned. He trusted leather." And by completing this round, Mr. Arthur stood up in the booth, his face white as a sheet. He knocked his chair over. "That's a lie. It is authenticated by the maker's mark," Holloway said, his voice booming. He looked up at the booth. "And Arthur, you might want to look behind you. The state attorney is here. They received an email this morning with high-resolution photographs of the paper documents you burned." Thomas looked toward the gate. Police officers were entering the judge's booth. The cameras caught Arthur Worthington being placed in handcuffs, shouting threats that no one was listening to anymore. Julian had already disappeared, slipping away into the crowd, a coward to the end. Thomas sat on Redemption, stunned. He looked at the jumbotron. He looked at the words stamped in gold. Jim hadn't just given him a test. He had given him armor. He had anticipated everything. Thomas patted Redemption's neck, tears streaming down his face. 6 months later, the autumn sun was gentle on the pastures of what was formerly the Blackwood estate. The leaves were turning gold and crimson, mirroring the peace that had settled over the land. The sign at the front gate had been changed. The main barn was bustling, but not with the elite of society. It was filled with children from the city, kids who had never seen a horse before, learning to brush tangled manes. It was a sanctuary for horses that had been discarded, just as Redemption had been. Thomas walked down the center aisle carrying a bucket of feed. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans and his old boots, though they were no longer held together with duct tape. He walked with a lighter step. The weight of the world was gone. He walked out to the main paddock. A woman was sitting on the porch of the renovated farmhouse, wrapped in a thick shawl, reading a book. Sarah Miller looked up and smiled. Her cheeks had color. The new treatments were working. She wasn't cured. It was a chronic condition, but she was living. She was happy. "Dinner's in an hour, Tom," she called out. Thomas whistled. From the far end of the field, a black shape detached itself from the herd. Redemption galloped toward him, his coat gleaming like oil, his head held high. There was no fear in his eyes anymore, only recognition and love. The horse skidded to a halt and nuzzled Thomas's chest, searching for a carrot. Thomas laughed and obliged. He rested his forehead against the horse's velvet nose, breathing in the scent of warm fur and hay. He thought about the saddle, now retired and sitting in a glass case in the main foyer, the leather finally at rest. He thought about Jim, the man he never met but who had saved his life from beyond the grave. "Thank you," Thomas whispered to the wind. Redemption huffed a warm breath against his neck. And for the first time in his life, Thomas Miller didn't feel the cold. He felt only the warmth of the sun, the strength of the horse, and the profound, quiet peace of finally being home. If this story of courage and second chances moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another inspiring tale of hope and the incredible bonds we share with horses. Share this video with a friend who needs to hear a story about overcoming the odds. Had settled over the land. The sign at the front gate had been changed. It now read the Redemption Center. The main barn was bustling, but not with the elite of society. It was filled with children from the city, kids who had never seen a horse before, learning to brush tangled manes. It was a sanctuary for horses that had been discarded, just as Redemption had been. Thomas walked down the center aisle carrying a bucket of fade. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans and his old boots, though they were no longer held together with duct tape. He walked with a lighter step. The weight of the world was gone. He walked out to the main paddock. A woman was sitting on the porch of the renovated farmhouse, wrapped in a thick shawl, reading a book. Sarah Miller looked up and smiled. Her cheeks had color. The new treatments were working. She wasn't cured. It was a chronic condition, but she was living. She was happy. "Dinner's in an hour, Tom," she called out. "I'll be there, Ma," Thomas whistled. From the far end of the field, a black shape detached itself from the herd. Redemption galloped toward him, his coat gleaming like oil, his head held high. There was no fear in his eyes anymore, only recognition and love. The horse skidded to a halt and nuzzled Thomas's chest, searching for a carrot. Thomas laughed and obliged. He rested his forehead against the horse's velvet nose, breathing in the scent of warm fur and hay. He thought about the saddle, now retired and sitting in a glass case in the main foyer, the leather finally at rest. He thought about Jim, the man he never met but who had saved his life from beyond the grave. "Thank you," Thomas whispered to the wind. Redemption huffed a warm breath against his neck, and for the first time in his life, Thomas Miller didn't feel the cold. He felt only the warmth of the sun, the strength of the horse, and the profound, quiet peace of finally being home. If this story of courage and second chances moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another inspiring tale of hope and the incredible bonds we share with horses. Share this video with a friend who needs to hear a story about overcoming the odds.